Namaskar and welcome to NatStrat Conversations. My name is Pankaj Saran and I welcome you to another episode of our conversations where we bring you conversations on geopolitics, on national security and on technology. Today we are very fortunate to have a very distinguished guest with us, Ambassador Nirupama Rao, who needs very little introduction, and I want to welcome you, ma'am, to our show and to say
Thank
how
you.
happy we are to have you with us. Ambassador Rao is someone who actually has served as a role model for generations of Indian diplomats. She has served as India's High Commissioner to Sri Lanka, as India's ambassador to China, as the Foreign Secretary, and then after that as India's ambassador to the United States. And in doing so, she has broken many barriers. First woman Indian ambassador to Sri Lanka and to China. One of the other great aspects of her personality is her love for music, and we will discuss that also a little bit. But let me begin by asking you, you have seen so much of the world, you've written so extensively, you're also an established authority on the India-China border, the negotiations, decades of that, and you've been active on social media, on Twitter, and of course you were part of this very small group of intellectuals who was invited by Foreign Policy to write a letter to the future US president on what, in your view, should be his or her agenda and so on. So now that we are in the middle of a transition in the United States to a new administration, I want to begin by asking you your thoughts on how you view the 10 years since you left the US in terms of the evolution of the Indo-US relationship. It's come a long way, but just to kick off the discussion.
Thank you very much, Pankaj, and I'm really privileged to be a part of the NatStrat conversation today. And I'm really looking forward to our discussion. So in the last 10 years, so much has happened in the world around us, not just in the United States, but all across our planet. This has been a season of change, and change that in many senses one may call quite fundamental, perhaps not cataclysmic, but certainly fundamental. And you see it in the disorderly, unstable state of the world today. It's as if we are between orders. One doesn't know what order will come, but certainly things have changed. And I was saying to somebody the other day, this is really the end of history. It's not what Fukuyama wrote in the early 90s. I think this is the end of history as we know it, as we've experienced it, as we've defined it. There's a whole new generation of people who are choosing their leaders. Mm-hmm. There is this trend towards populism and nationalism, and it's not just confined to the United States, as we've seen with the re-election of Mr. Donald Trump. So these are, it's as if the world has been in a state of flux over the last 10 years. But you asked me about the India-US relationship. In this season of change, and in a world that we would like to see as or define as multipolar, but which countries like the US and China really in their heart of hearts, I think, look at it as a bipolar situation. Yeah. And a situation of bipolarity can be somewhat different. Growing tensions, growing competition. The other day, Ambassador Nick Burns, the US ambassador in Beijing, was telling a conference that this relationship between the US and China, although it's a most consequential relationship, is also fiercely competitive. And the emphasis was on the word fierce. Mm-hmm. Fiercely competitive, which has a ring to it, a kind of foreboding, I think, to it. Mm-hmm. India and the US have a very stable, well-sustained relationship, and the trajectory has been upward for at least 2 decades now. True. And what you've seen, despite the change of office at the White House, presidents come and go, either Democrat or Republican, But when it comes to the relationship between our two democracies, between India and the United States, there is a bipartisan consensus within the United States, in the houses, both houses of Congress, for bigger and better relations with India.
Yeah.
So that has certainly been a trend we've observed in the last 10 years. And, you know, things like critical and emerging technologies,
Right.
defense and security cooperation, co-production,
Right.
you know, our scientists working together, outer space
Right,
cooperation,
right.
cooperation on cyber,
Correct.
quantum computing, climate change,
Mm.
you name it, and the people-to-people ties,
Absolutely.
of course.
Absolutely.
Because, as I've always said, people are the beating heart of this relationship.
Absolutely. No, ma'am, that's a fantastic overview that you've given. But I want to ask you, you know, there is this belief that within the Democrats and the Republicans, there is a certain difference in how they perceive India or look at India. Would you buy that thesis? That there is a difference between the two parties in terms of how they...
Yeah. I would answer that question by making one core point. It's that the Republican Party in the United States has somewhat changed its character and its concerns and interests, as we've seen. You know, it's now a party that identifies more with people below a certain income, rather than, you know, the Wall Street capitalists, or, you know, how the Republican Party traditionally had among its followers and its acolytes people of means within the United States.
Correct.
Today it's very different. It's, you know, the pendulum has shifted. And so the Republican Party is very much today, if you look at the US population and look at the large numbers who have not been to college, who live in the rural areas, who live in the Rust Belt, who've had their jobs taken away because, you know, it was China, China all the way.
Correct.
So that is the Republican Party. And they have, in a sense, been looking inwards a lot into the domestic priorities of the United States.
So how do you...
As far as the Democrats are concerned, I think, yes, their approach traditionally, and I'm not saying it has stood in the way of better relations, because relations have improved nonetheless. But they tend to be more didactic. They do use a bit of the bully pulpit, but for that matter, even Donald Trump uses the bully pulpit when he wants to, because he is looking for deals, he's looking for the advantage to America. So in a sense, I think you are dealing with Americans across the board, whether they're Democrats or Republican.
And I think maybe we are just getting better at handling transitions over time.
Well, yes, because of the stable nature of the relationship. When I presume you're referring to the
India-US.
India-US. I mean, transitions have been weathered very well.
So what do you think we should be expecting from the new administration as they settle down from Trump? I mean, people regard him as a big disruptor, and, you know, this whole, as you said, focus on America. What would you say we should expect from...
First of all, I think Mr. Trump takes our Prime Minister very seriously. I mean, there's a good chemistry between them, but even more than that, I think he takes India seriously, which is good. I mean, which means that he will give the relationship attention. And the people around him, you know, Senator Marco Rubio, he's been nominated, or is going to be the Secretary of State, and even the National Security Advisor designate, Mike Walsh, has been in the India caucus. He is, in fact, I think, headed.
He's the co-chair.
He's the co-chair of the India caucus. So they have a certain involvement with India, which is of a positive nature. They are committed to better relations with India and to build on the foundations and the progress we've made over the last decade. So in a sense, there is a continuity about this, a continuum, I would say, about this relationship. And I believe Mr. Trump will carry that forward. It's another matter when it comes to trade, which is very central. Apart from deregulation, trade is very central to the Trumpian universe. And although he has threatened China with 60% tariffs on their exports, he's talking about the rest of the world, 10 to 20%. So, you know, we fall in that category. And since we do have, the US has a trade deficit with us, I'm sure that the president-elect will latch on to that, and there will be some, some excitement, if I can put it mildly, but certainly pressure on that score.
So it's in his mind that India is the tariff king.
Yes, and he loves the word tariff. President-elect Trump says it's the most beautiful word in the dictionary.
So we should perhaps be bracing ourselves for some pushback.
Yes. I think we should, and I think we have to also perhaps make our own calculus of what kind of response we will have and how we will be able to smoothen the differences on this. And essentially, I think the relationship is in a good position. It's able to weather a lot of turbulence whenever it happens. Very different from what it was in the past. It's not a hyphenated relationship anymore with any other country. Or, looking at South Asia as a whole with India as a part of it. India is seen for what it is, for itself, leading and one of the largest democracy in the world, and sitting in terms of geography, which defines geopolitics also, astride the Indian Ocean. So we are the in the Indo-Pacific, whatever the Chinese may say. I know they have a predilection to favor the Asia-Pacific. But I say, why don't we call it Indo-Pacific Asia?
That's interesting. But obviously, a part of this is the fact that the expectations also then rise from India, isn't it? From the Americans, from the corporate America, from business America, and from other American interests.
Expectations will definitely be high. And from our side also, we have areas in which we would like to see this relationship strengthened, even though it's not an alliance relationship, but it's a very comprehensive strategic partnership. So I think our ability to develop strategic communication with the Trump presidency is also important, because he's going to be surrounded by loyalists rather than key professional figures who have an established reputation in whatever field they are dealing with. So there is that element of uncertainty that has crept into the debate, as it were, and the outlook, and how policies will be framed, how they will be implemented. But as I said, this strategic relationship between India and the United States is important for both countries. It's important for the region. It's important in the context of the rise of China. And India is very well positioned from that point of view. And I think we should be able to take advantage of that unique position that we have.
So from whatever you've said, it appears as if you are seeing better days ahead compared to the Biden administration. Can one deduce that from your comments?
As I said, this is a relationship that is able to cope with all changes of weather. In the sense, the equilibrium has been established. The navigational mechanisms to this relationship we have always had a steady hand on the wheel. In that sense, I believe that I would look to the future in an anticipatory way, hoping that this relationship grows in strength and further substance. And why I say that the days ahead may be good for the relationship is because from the United States point of view also, there is no quarrel where that viewpoint is concerned. Both sides want to see this relationship improve and develop further because of all the factors in geopolitics today, apart from the bilateral need for us to develop relations, but there is that whole geopolitical context in which we exist today.
No, but now that you mentioned the bigger picture which you need, and here China is a factor that you have already mentioned. I mean, you've written this marvelous treatise on Tibet and China and the relationship, and you are no less an expert on China. How do you read the India-US China triangle and the impact of these dynamics on each other? I mean, in Kazan, we have launched a normalization process with China, just as a new administration is going to take office. So how does this fit into a Trumpian view, and how will we navigate the India-China normalization even as we are moving ahead with our relationship with the United States?
You know, Pankaj, I wouldn't go so far as to say that a normalization process has been launched between India and China. I think the key has turned with opening the door. And after 4 years of this relationship being a situation where both countries had turned their backs on each other, we have changed that orientation, and communication has begun. And I spoke of strategic communication in the US-India context. In the case of China, now China is an adversary. I mean, we don't need to beat around the bush about that. We have differences with China. We have issues to be resolved, which are not easy to settle. There has been tension and confrontation on our shared border, which is one of the longest land borders in the world, and the most unsettled of borders. What direction are we going to take on that? So to my mind, if you're talking of normalization, you are looking at a relationship where communication, linkages, and interaction is strengthened across the spectrum. And I think it's too early to say that. For instance, we don't have direct flights between India and China anymore. Our trade has grown, of course, it's grown despite all the differences, which shows how connected both countries are today. Unlike in the 60s, after the 62 conflict, we had a period of deep freeze in our relations, but there was very little happening on other fronts with China. But today, it's not like that. Our trade linkages with China have continued despite the coldness in the relationship, the absence of trust, and the confrontation along the line of actual control. Now, with a trade deficit, China enjoying this trade deficit with India of 103 billion US dollars, how are we going to approach that? And as we grow in capacity and in ability and influence, and as our power increases, you know, what is the Chinese attitude going to be? And if I'm going to cite experience, there is definitely, I think, a Chinese approach to India, which is a containing approach. You see it in South Asia. You see it in China's relations with our neighbours. You see it, for instance, the other day in one of the online seminars or discussions one was watching. A speaker from the Indian side was saying how, you know, as our capabilities grow, for instance, you know, our renewable energy industry is taking off. We're beginning to make our solar panels, and you know, when it comes to certain items that we need, like ingots and wafers, the Chinese are not giving it to us, or they're, you know, making it difficult. Similarly, tunnel boring equipment, when we are engaged in building our infrastructure in the border areas, and we need that equipment, you know, the approach has been very, I would say, quite negative from the Chinese side. So they will, you know, the Chinese leadership or their foreign ministry will speak, you know, as they always speak, about having a stable, cooperative relationship with India. Lots of homilies. But one has to, you know, taste the coffee on this.
Absolutely. So we have to keep our eyes open.
Not just smell it, but taste it.
Taste the coffee. Absolutely. And so do the Americans, I suppose. I think the Trumpian, as you have mentioned in one of your, rightly, that it was Trump who actually put China on the map of Washington, D.C. in his first term.
No, the Americans, I mean, you listen to somebody like Orville Schell when he speaks about the history of the relationship. In fact, you know, one has to be candid enough to say that China and the Chinese were literally cradled by the United States in the reform and opening up period, because they felt that the Chinese system would change, that, you know, there was going to be political transformation in China apart from all the economic growth and trade flourishing, manufacturing flourishing. It didn't happen, and China became the chief rival. And the US contributed a great deal to China's rise to greatness, if one may say so. So there's a lot of soul searching to be done on these issues in the US. Today, of course, they've turned their backs on China. They don't have much people-to-people ties, even that. So a whole relationship of half a century has, in a sense, I would say, torn to shreds.
So Trump is actually trying to turn the wheel and the ship.
Yeah, with Trump, Mr. Trump, he's very quixotic. And the New York Times recently, Ezra Klein of the New York Times used this term disinhibited, which is a part of his voter appeal also, because he says what he wants at these in the campaign speeches, and people are delighted, especially that segment of the population, as I said, that looks to him with great hope, that wants to be protectionist, that wants to shut America's doors on immigrants coming in. So what he will do with China will be interesting. But the appointments, the Secretary of State and NSA appointments are of China hawks, and they want to take a strong line on China. But I don't know. It can't, obviously, you can't be looking for regime change on the part of the US in China, even if it may be occasionally there's a Freudian slip and they talk about it. But that's not going to be, it's easier, envisaged than really done.
Absolutely.
The Chinese and the Chinese Communist Party and the way the Chinese economy has consolidated and grown over these are real indices, I would say, of a country that has risen. And you have somebody like Xi Jinping, of course, who wants to dominate China in every sense.
But this view that, obviously the decoupling idea is not making much traction. It's more about de-risking, etc. But is that feasible in the Trump's 4 years? I mean, he'll try to do that, I suppose. But
well, the tariffs is the that kind of weapon that he threatens to wield when it comes to China. But what are those tariffs, high tariffs, going to result in for the American consumer?
Correct.
What will happen on inflation? We'll have to see. Although Mr. Trump's advisors seem to think, like Robert Lighthizer, is a great votary of tariffs. In fact, he had this piece in the Financial Times the other day saying that, obviously referring to China, that China had, through its manufacturing for exports and with great subsidies thrown in, has essentially followed a beggar thy neighbor approach. I mean, without naming China. So when you have that kind of outlook on China, you're going to take steps, obviously, to change that and to initiate a transformation in the relationship, which, in a sense, would see it going backwards rather than forward.
So I suppose the Chinese are getting ready for a rough
yes,
period.
I think it's a brace situation for the Chinese, I think.
And how is the economy doing, ma'am, in terms of?
The economy, I mean, indications suggest that it has slowed down. That peak having been achieved, the rate of GDP growth has slowed down. They're talking about a stimulus for local governments, as you know. But the fact is that, they have reason, I believe, to be worried about unemployment among educated youth. And if you're cutting down manufacturing for exports in China once and, doing this decentralized supply chains. You go to Mexico, you go to Malaysia, you go to Vietnam. Not so much to India, because I heard somewhere that the buzz, the grapevine in China is not to India. Decoupling, as they define it, this decentralization of the supply chain and sending manufacturing abroad, is not, India could very well be the destination for such manufacturing, so that, we obviously would like high-tech jobs to be created for our vast pool of, engineers and S&T, science and technology people. But the fact is, the larger proportion of the population, if we are to, be able to convert India into this mecca for manufacturing, that's where, the jobs will be generated. That's where our demographic dividend can be made full use of.
Absolutely, no question about it. Now, coming to this other aspect about how he's viewing Russia and the Ukraine conflict, and what do you think of his approach so far?
Well, he has very loftily proclaimed that he'll be able to sort this out in a day. But in the Trumpian universe, a day may be more than 24 hours. So we'll have to wait and see. But certainly, if the stage at which this conflict is at the moment, it seems to be going nowhere. And the Ukrainians are losing more territory. 20% of their territory is already in Russia, under Russian occupation. And if you're going to have a deal that will leave Ukraine essentially vanquished by Russia, I don't know. We'll see how Europe would react to that. Exactly. This is an issue on which Europe is also divided. There are countries in the EU that are more.
Absolutely.
I mean, take Hungary, for instance.
Absolutely.
But then on the other hand, you have Poland, which is. So it's often the Eastern Europeans who seem to be kind of setting the barometer on this. So we don't know if he's going to, shut down the conflict. I mean, essentially shut down the conflict. You're not going to supply equip. But if the Russians don't play ball, what is his attitude going to be vis-a-vis his friend Vladimir Putin?
Correct.
And of course, with Mr. Zelensky, Mr. Trump has had differences in the past, and they've had their sparring matches, and Zelensky has been quite a fighter on this, and he's managed to hold the ground. But we really don't know, and it's very unfortunate, this conflict, and it kind of redefines even within Europe, what the future is going to look like.
Exactly.
Apart from, of course, Mr. Trump almost, saying that you have to pay your dues, in the sense if you need protection, you have to pay your dues. I mean, that's more like, it sounds very Cosa Nostra.
Correct. So it seems that both adversaries and friends and allies are not going to remain unaffected.
Nobody's immune. Nobody's immune. Yeah, we don't have inbuilt immunity to Donald Trump, I'm afraid.
That's quite extraordinary.
Yeah.
So on the last foreign policy aspect on South Asia, we briefly discussed on Pakistan. Do you say anything, or that is not so central to the whole discussion?
So before that, I'd like to just say a few words on India-China and the border disengagement
please,
on the line of actual control that we've had. We don't have the details, and obviously we've been in government, and we don't. And these details perhaps will never be disclosed for public consumption. But the fact is, these patrolling limits and better coordination between India and China as far as patrolling is concerned, well, that in essence, in principle, is a good thing, that you avoid military clashes. But where is the LAC today after Galwan and what happened in 2020 and all the Chinese inroads across the LAC? What is inexplicable to my mind is why the Chinese should have done this. I mean, you can argue that it's because, the India-US relationship has grown and they wanted to put pressure and tell you, don't take this relationship for granted.
Sure.
But, the buffer zones that have been created, the patrolling patterns that we are talking of, there's a lot still to be ironed out. I mean, that's my guess. My instinct tells me that that the devil is in the detail, literally. And we will have to be vigilant along the border, along the LAC. But make sure that we avoid confrontations of the type that happened in Galwan. I think from both sides have to be super cautious, I believe, about that, avoiding that kind of military confrontation, which essentially sets the relationship back again for a few years. We'll have to look at the peace and tranquility agreements that we already have, and they are in place, the 5, sets of CBM agreements and peace and tranquility agreements, whether we need to supplement that, whether we need to add to that, whether we need to build on that. So that's still something that we'll have to work on.
We have a huge history of negotiation and of the border and the LAC and the friction points and everything else. So hopefully all that will not be forgotten, and we will learn lessons from 2020 as we go forward.
I think it was a huge jolt, I think, to the relationship, what happened in Galwan. And it seems like, in that one night, what we had done for 30 years in this relationship, that is where we sought to normalize both sides. It just disappeared in thin air.
Have you had any conversations with any Chinese experts or scholars on 2020 and their interpretation or assessment?
Well, my own experience has been they're never very forthcoming about this, and obviously the answers lie mainly with the PLA,
sure.
because the two armies are essentially confronting
Correct.
each other. Whether the leadership, this is a leadership-controlled or generated situation, I can't really say. But I get the impression that from now on, after all, one of the lessons that has been learned by China from Galwan is that the political leadership will now decide what happens, that clashes of this nature, the movement of their army in these areas, any change, everything has to be cleared at the top level. I believe there's more centralization as far as this relationship is concerned.
That may be good.
Yeah, it's a good thing in a sense if we can avoid such situations, because they do harm to both sides.
So finally, on South Asia, Pakistan, any comments would you have, or you don't think it is?
I think, I always say when I look west towards Pakistan, I see the Great Wall of India. And for good reason, because our experience with the Pakistani deep state over the years, the fact that our people became victims of cross-border terrorism. So what you see today is a national level consensus that with Pakistan, given this experience and the fallout of that over the years, it has been a very bitter experience. And I don't believe any individual can be asked to just swallow that bitterness and say, let's resume relations, dialogue and interaction with Pakistan. However much people there might want it. That is the sad reality, and it's the story of our lives since partition. So 75 years have been replete with this kind of difference, conflict, and engineered conflict, I would say, from the other side. Engineered conflict.
So you're not very optimistic?
No, I'm not optimistic. I mean, ideally, yes, South Asia, I've always said, is an integer. We should be far more integrated as we look eastward, acting eastward essentially. But Myanmar is also in a very tough place today. I mean, the military junta there and all the rebel groups that are active and who are carving out territory for themselves in the country.
So basically surrounded by states in different grades of failure.
Perhaps I would not use the word failure, but compromised in many ways, I would say. And but then we have made, I believe, my assessment is that genuine efforts have been made where our other neighbours are concerned to build stronger relations and to have a very mature, balanced outlook as far as these. I mean, take with Sri Lanka, even with the Maldives, for instance. I think we bided our time, we stood our ground. And I believe our interests have been, in that sense, well protected. And we made it quite clear that we work for the benefit of these smaller neighbours. And we're not seeking, reciprocity.
Correct.
So there is that element of give without take, that India is capable of doing as our economic strength has grown. And as our ability to deliver development assistance or humanitarian relief or be the first responder when there's an economic crisis, as it happened with Sri Lanka. And even with the Maldives, we've been there to bail them out, which the Chinese tend to be quite straight-jacketed about. They're not able to do as much, although they have all kinds of schemes in many of these countries.
In fact, the China-Pakistan economic relationship is under severe stress, I think.
Yeah, I've been reading about that, and yes,
so
that is a fact.
Since we are on South Asia, maybe we could end on a happier note about asking you about the initiative that you took on the South Asian Symphony Orchestra. It's in your own love for music, and how it sits with your scholarship and writings and interest in the tough issues of strategy and global contestation. Would you like to share a little bit about the orchestra?
Well, I think I wanted to demonstrate that there is life after retirement, first and foremost, and that one can utilize one's knowledge and experience garnered over the years when you're a professional diplomat to seek greater understanding with people across this region of South Asia. And I felt that citizen-level diplomacy, especially in the field of the arts and culture can provide that kind of, in a very modest way. It may be just a drop in the ocean, but still, it's a drop that matters. And that's how I set up this trust, not-for-profit trust in Bangalore 6 years ago, called the South Asian Symphony Foundation, with the aim of creating an orchestra, symphony orchestra, of people drawn from the region and from the diaspora. Mm-hmm. And at that time, I never envisaged that the prospect of this orchestra growing into a multinational orchestra. Today, we have about 13, 14 nationalities represented in the orchestra. So I call it, in fact, an orchestra today of the global South, even more than South Asia. And orchestras are important to me, and as I look at the world around us, orchestras are a model of what human society should be like, because you meet strangers, and there's a word they have in orchestral parlance in their vocabulary. It's called desking. Mm-hmm. That you and I, we are desked. We are working together. Right. We are, the output is harmony through music, and a completely plurilateral institution. People drawn from all countries coming together and working together to ensure that harmony. And
for a greater good.
Well, at least I believe we've been able to, for the first time in this country, create a group of musicians that have a genuine sense of community coming here. They enjoy coming to India. They enjoy discovering our cities, they enjoy making friends, and among them, among these musicians, there's communication, and there is a certain constancy of friendship that we've been able to create.
But that's so remarkable in this kind of a world that we've just discussed, which is full of tension and contest and all kinds of fragmentation. This is a great experiment. It's like in a fairly figurative sense, it actually represents Indian thought and
it's part, I think, of our civilizational ethos to speak of cultivating friendship among nations, to renounce war, to renounce aggression and conflict, and to be generous and compassionate, and also to be able to practice self-control.
Absolutely. But thank you so much, ma'am. This has been an absolutely remarkable tour de horizon of so many different subjects and issues.
Thank you very much for inviting me.
No, I'm really grateful to you for sharing your views, and we marvel at your energy and your contribution to everything, not just politics, but much more than that.
Thank you so much, Pankaj.
Yeah, thank you very much, ma'am. Thanks a lot. Thank you so much. Dear viewers, thank you so much for joining us. We just completed an absolutely marvelous conversation with Ambassador Nirupama Rao. And we hope you would have benefited and enjoyed this wide-ranging conversation. Till we meet again for our next episodes, stay tuned, and thank you very much for joining us. Namaskar.